How do you balance the value, if any, of lived experience?
Well, experience is also subjective perspective. It also doesn't look at causation. It doesn't look at interaction between those people. It's a way, it's a mild, again, misattribution. Lived experience is a nice way of saying, let me bully you. You submit to what I say and you don't complain about it, or else I'm going to pick on you. So I'm not saying lived experience doesn't have value. We've been talking about the fact that I experienced significant racism when I was in graduate school, for instance, and it mattered. But by saying no one else has a right to talk about it unless they've had the exact same experience that I did, we're losing out on shared experience. For instance, when you have Black people saying, oh, no white person can understand what I'm going through. If you get a group of women together, there are so many things that women often experience. We have more in common than we don't. And you lose that if you automatically look at anyone who doesn't look exactly like you, sound exactly like you, as your enemy.
We're also being trained. I mean, I suppose it depends what you're talking about, doesn't it? Because obviously, if you're talking about what it feels like to be oppressed in a certain way, if you've never been oppressed in a certain way, then you don't have the standing to have a conversation about what that feels like. But if, on the other hand, you're having a conversation about public policy, about, that is dependent on, for example, data about Indigenous deaths in custody or something like that, then you surely can have a conversation about that data, even if you're not an Indigenous person. But we seem to currently be confusing those two categories of conversation, such that you need the lived experience in order to have standing, even to have a conversation about facts on the ground. Is there a way out of that Chinese finger puzzle?
Yes. And with my Healing the Rift program, because what I did is in 2020, when I saw the Black Lives Matter protests really taking off, and I knew, because as a social psychologist, I've studied flow-on effects, and I knew that this was taking us in a place where racial disunity was going to become significantly worse. So I developed a program called Healing the Rift. And let's talk about the lived experience thing. Let's say that I'm dealing with someone and their grandmother was in the Holocaust. If that person and I get together and they do everything and we have a safe space together where I'm not considered a bad person because my grandmother didn't go through the Holocaust, and she's not looking at me as the enemy, and I know that, then you can actually have something where you find common threads, you find storytelling where you can walk that person through what you're talking about, allowing them to see the world a bit from the eyes of the person who has experienced whatever it is you're talking about, and give them some level of understanding. But it only happens if they're not under attack, if you're not making them defensive, if you're not criticizing them and calling them privileged. This whole word privilege is just, it makes I tell you, my dentist said, you're grinding your teeth. Yeah.
I'm hearing about too much privilege, Doc.
Yes, I'm grinding my
teeth. What do you make of privilege as a notion? Why does it make you grind your teeth at night, Dina?
Because it's normally, again, what the woke have done very cleverly and in a very sinister way is alter the definitions of everything. So now racism is just being white. It used to mean conscious hatred of other groups because of their race. Now it just means walking about living your life if you don't happen to be Black or brown. When you're talking about privilege used to mean somebody with a trust fund who would get bailed out of jail even when they committed a crime. Now it's saying, if I am a group, if I belong to a group, whether I'm born into that group or whether it's a group that I have decided to join, then you are privileged if you're not in my group. And therefore, you have nothing to say. You should step aside. You should let me do what I want because you're privileged. It's horrible. It's absolute, and people get so defensive, and I'm glad they get defensive because they should not accept this. I try to explain to people that what they're really describing isn't privilege. It's saying that the group you belong to does not normally face negative discrimination because of that characteristic. So if you're talking,
Isn't that a privilege though, Dina?
in a way it is. It's like when you walk through life, let's talk about an example growing up. When I grew up, if we went on a road trip, we would have to think about where we were driving through and how they treated Black people. Because it may be possible we wouldn't be able to find a place to get food. We might not be able to find a place to sleep that would accept Black people. If we broke down on the side of the road, we might not get any help. So in that way, I can understand that not being exceptional, not facing negative discrimination because of a characteristic does give you a bit of an edge. It's not a privilege, it's just a little bit of an edge. But it doesn't take into account anything else that is going in your life. I know white people that have had much harder lives than I've had, much harder. So to
But
call
isn't the point of isn't the point of articulating white privilege not to say that all white people have it better off than all Black people, but that a white person doesn't have to worry about being discriminated against on the basis of their whiteness? And that is a certain privilege. I walk into a shop, I don't have to worry about whether or not the person behind the counter is racist. Maybe I do if they're, from some particular ethnicity that has a chip on its shoulder about white people, but generally not.
If you are the same, if you belong to the same group as the people in power, then as a general rule, you're not discriminated against because of that. It's like the way that men can walk through life in a way women can't. I know that Jackson Katz, who wrote the Macho Paradox, does a seminar where it's mixed sex seminar. And he starts off by asking the men, all right, guys, I'm going to write this down. What did you do today when you got up to keep yourself from being sexually assaulted? The guys laugh. A few of them say, I didn't go to jail. But for the most part, they make a joke of it. Then he asks the women, and they start the list. I wore this, I didn't wear that. I look where I parked my car. I had my keys here. I told someone where I was going. So again, you're talking about the fact that when you don't belong to the group that has the most power, it does impact what you have to think about as you go through your day, as you decide what you're going to do for your living, if you're going to planning your holiday, for instance. And it does matter. But the approach that we have right now is so alienating and so divisive. It really isn't going to make things better. The backlash is going to send us back to the 1850s if we're not careful.